The ground shook with each thunderous step. Deep within the Iron Mountains, the dwarves felt the vibrations long before they saw the shadow that blocked out the sun. King Throman Ironbeard stood at the highest watchtower of the great fortress city of Khazad-hom, his weathered hands gripping the stone railing as he watched the horror approach from the eastern wastes. It was a machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. 300 feet tall, it walked on 6 massive iron legs that crushed entire forests with each stride. Its body was a twisted combination of metal and dark magic, covered in thousands of spinning gears and belching smokestacks. At the center of the mechanical monster sat a massive cannon that glowed with green fire. The goblins had built something terrible, and now they were bringing it straight toward the heart of the Dwarven kingdom. For generations, the goblins had been nothing more than a minor annoyance. They lived in the wastelands beyond the mountains, fighting among themselves and occasionally raiding small villages for scraps of food and metal. The dwarves had never considered them a real threat. They were too stupid, too disorganized, and too weak to ever challenge the mighty fortress cities carved into the mountains. But something had changed in the goblin tribes. Something had united them under a single purpose. King Throman turned to his chief engineer, a dwarf named Boric Steelhammer, who had spent his entire life building the weapons and machines that protected the kingdom. The old engineer looked pale as he studied the approaching monster through a brass telescope. The king asked what they were facing. Boric lowered the telescope with trembling hands. He explained that the goblins called it the World Breaker. According to the scouts who had barely escaped with their lives, the goblins had been building it in secret for nearly 20 years. They had stolen technology from the human kingdoms, magic from the elven forests, and mining techniques from dwarven traders, who never suspected what their knowledge would be used for. The World Breaker continued its march toward Khazad-hom. Through his own telescope, the king could see thousands of goblins swarming around the base of the machine like ants around a hill. They carried weapons and wore crude armor made from scraps of metal. Their eyes glowed with a fanatical devotion that the dwarves had never seen before in the goblin race. Leading them was the goblin warlord known only as Skargash the Clever. He was different from other goblins. Taller, smarter, and more patient than any of his kind. While other goblin leaders fought for immediate rewards, Skargash had spent decades planning this moment. He had united the scattered tribes through a combination of cunning manipulation and brutal violence. He had promised them something that goblins had never dared to dream of before. He had promised them a kingdom of their own, carved from the bones of their oldest enemies. Inside the control chamber of the World Breaker, Skargash watched the dwarven fortress grow larger through a viewing portal made of enchanted glass. His thin lips twisted into a cruel smile. The dwarves had looked down on his people for too long. They had called them vermin, pests, creatures too stupid to ever amount to anything. Today, Skargash would teach them the price of their arrogance. He gave the order to prepare the main cannon. The goblins around him scrambled to obey, pulling levers and turning wheels that channeled magical energy into the massive weapon. The green glow intensified until the entire machine hummed with barely contained power. Back in Khazad-hom, the warning bells rang throughout the city. Dwarven soldiers rushed to their positions along the walls, loading crossbows and preparing catapults. But King Throman knew that their traditional defenses would be useless against the approaching monster. The World Breaker was simply too big, too powerful, and too well protected for their weapons to cause any real damage. He gathered his war council in the throne room, a massive chamber carved from solid granite and decorated with the trophies of 1,000 years of dwarven victories. The generals and advisors argued among themselves, each proposing a different strategy that might save the kingdom. Some wanted to evacuate the city and flee into the deeper tunnels of the mountain. Others suggested negotiating with the goblins and offering tribute in exchange for peace. A few hot-headed warriors demanded an immediate attack, preferring to die in battle rather than cower behind their walls. But it was the youngest member of the council, who offered a different perspective. Her name was Kira Brightforge, a master smith who had spent years studying the ancient texts left behind by the first Dwarven engineers. She had read about weapons and machines that made the Worldbreaker look like a child's toy. The knowledge had been lost during the Great Catastrophe, but had nearly destroyed their civilization 3,000 years ago. But fragments remained, hidden in the deepest vaults of the kingdom. She spoke with a confidence that surprised the older dwarves. She explained that their ancestors had faced threats like this before. They had built weapons capable of bringing down mountains and machines that could walk between worlds. The knowledge was not completely lost. She believed she could rebuild one of the ancient war golems if given enough time and resources. The king asked how much time she needed. Kira's face fell as she admitted she would need at least 3 months to complete the project. But the Worldbreaker would reach their walls within 2 days. The council fell silent as the hopelessness of their situation became clear. Even if they could build a weapon capable of stopping the goblin machine, there was simply not enough time. The Worldbreaker would crush their city long before they could mount any real defense. But King Throman was not ready to accept defeat. He had ruled the Dwarven kingdom for over 100 years, and he had seen his people overcome challenges that seemed impossible. He ordered Kira to begin work on the war golem immediately, using every resource and every worker in the city. Then he turned to his generals and gave them a different task. They would slow down the Worldbreaker by any means necessary, buying Kira the time she needed to complete her work. The Dwarven army marched out from the fortress gates the next morning. 10,000 warriors in gleaming armor, carrying axes and hammers that had been passed down through generations. They knew they were marching to their deaths, but not a single dwarf hesitated. They would fight for their kingdom, their families, and their honor. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest in Dwarven history. The soldiers attacked the legs of the Worldbreaker with explosives and mining charges, trying to damage the joints that allowed the machine to walk. Goblin warriors swarmed down from the machine to meet them, and the fighting spread across miles of rocky terrain. For every goblin that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. For every explosive charge that detonated against the machine's legs, the goblins quickly repaired the damage. But the dwarves kept fighting, kept dying, kept buying precious hours for Kira and her team of engineers. Inside the mountain, the work continued without rest. Kira pushed herself and her workers beyond all reasonable limits. They excavated the ancient vault where the war golem had been stored, finding the massive machine covered in dust and cobwebs. The technology was more advanced than anything they had ever seen, using principles of engineering that seemed almost magical in their complexity. But Kira was a true master of her craft. She studied the ancient blueprints, deciphered the forgotten languages, and slowly began to understand how the golem worked. She replaced damaged components with newly forged parts, rewired the control systems, and loaded the weapons with ammunition that had been stored in sealed containers for 3,000 years. On the 3rd day, the Worldbreaker finally reached the walls of Khazad-home. Only 2,000 Dwarven soldiers remained from the original army, most of them wounded and exhausted. The Goblin cannon charged its terrible green fire, preparing to blast through the fortress gates. Skargash stood at the viewing portal, savoring his moment of triumph. He gave the order to fire. The cannon roared with a sound like thunder and lightning combined, sending a beam of destructive energy directly at the heart of the Dwarven city. But the beam never reached its target. Something massive and golden rose from behind the fortress walls, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. The war golem caught the energy beam with one enormous hand, absorbing the attack into its own power systems. Then it stepped over the walls and charged directly at the Worldbreaker. Skargash screamed orders at his crew, demanding that they fire again. But the war golem was already too close. It slammed into the Worldbreaker with the force of an avalanche, tearing through the outer armor like paper. The two machines grappled with each other, crashing through the battlefield and crushing goblins beneath their enormous feet. Kira sat in the control chamber of the war golem, her hands moving across the ancient controls with practiced precision. She had less than an hour of training with the machine, but her instincts guided her movements. She knew exactly where to strike to cause the most damage. The war golem ripped one of the World Breaker's legs completely off, sending the goblin machine crashing to the ground. Scargash tried to escape, scrambling toward an emergency exit at the back of the control chamber. But the war golem's massive hand smashed through the wall, crushing the escape route and trapping him inside. The final blow came from the war golem's primary weapon, a concentrated beam of pure energy that cut through the World Breaker's core like a knife through butter. The green fire that had powered the goblin machine exploded outward, consuming everything in a massive fireball that could be seen from 100 miles away. When the smoke cleared, only the war golem remained standing. The World Breaker was nothing but twisted metal and scattered debris. The goblin army had been shattered, their warlord destroyed along with his terrible machine. The survivors fled back toward the wastelands, their dreams of conquest dying with every step. King Throman met Kira at the gates of the city. He had tears in his eyes as he embraced the young engineer who had saved their kingdom. He asked her how she had done it, how she had brought the ancient machine back to life when everyone had told her it was impossible. Kira smiled and gave him a simple answer. She explained that the ancient dwarves had faced impossible challenges too. They had built these machines not because they knew they would win, but because they refused to accept defeat. That spirit of defiance had been sleeping in the war golem for 3,000 years, waiting for someone brave enough to wake it up. The Dwarven kingdom celebrated their victory for weeks. They honored the fallen soldiers who had sacrificed themselves to buy the time needed for victory. They rebuilt what had been damaged and strengthened their defenses against future threats. And they never forgot the lesson they had learned. No enemy was too powerful, no challenge too great, as long as they had the courage to keep fighting and the wisdom to remember the achievements of those who came before them. In the wastelands beyond the mountains, the surviving goblins scattered back to their individual tribes. The dream of a unified goblin nation died with Scargash, replaced once again by the petty conflicts and internal struggles that had always defined their race. But deep in the darkest corners of their caves, some goblins whispered about revenge. They spoke of new machines and new plans that would one day bring the dwarves to their knees. The war was over, but the hatred remained, waiting for the next leader clever enough to turn it into something dangerous. And in the great forge of Khazad-hûm, Kira Brightforge continued her work, studying the ancient texts and rebuilding the lost technologies of her ancestors. She knew that the World Breaker was only the beginning. Greater threats would come in the future, challenges that would test the limits of Dwarven courage and ingenuity. But she also knew that her people would be ready. They had faced the impossible and won. They would do it again as many times as necessary, for as long as their kingdom endured.